Thanks for joining us today on our COVID cast with the City of Sterling Heights. I'm Luke Bonner, the Senior Economic Development Advisor for the City of Sterling Heights. I'm joined with Stacy Zarko, President and CEO of the Sterling Heights Regional Chamber. Our special guest today is Bernard Swiecki from the Center for Automotive Research. Bernard, thanks for joining us. I know times are crazy in manufacturing, specifically in automotive manufacturing right now. And CAR has always had their pulse on everything automotive related. But I always felt like you more so have a good perspective on the community side of things, what communities deal with from a community economic development standpoint, and how the two sort of intertwine. So be interested to see kind of big picture of what's going on out there.
Yeah, no, and it's an ever evolving situation. But I think it's a particularly timely moment to have this conversation right now, because we are now at the threshold where we're trying to execute the restart. And right now, even the timing is uncertain, right? A lot of companies are talking about on or around May 18th, and there's a whole lot of variability into that. And, many things have to come together to actually make that happen. So I think this is the perfect time to have this conversation.
What's the difference? We worked together back in 09-10. And at that time, we worked very specifically when Chrysler closed the Sterling Heights assembly plant. And we formed our local, I guess, SWAT team, if you will, to beg and plead and, find information in a very cloak and dagger way to do everything we could with state partners and regional partners to get the plant reopened. That was a very different time. There were different factors that impacted the auto industry today. This is something that truly came out of left field. What do you think the difference is today, the financial impact, but also the potential recovery versus what happened in the Great Recession?
Yeah, first of all, Luke, even though they were very stressful times and a whole lot was happening all at the same time, I've got great fond memories of those days, 2009 or so, working with you on those efforts. But yeah, we have a few differences, but I think the main one that I just want to hit right away is this. In 2008, when the recession started, and in 2009 was the continuation, we had very low years of automobile sales and also automobile production. However, they were very much depressed, suppressed, but they didn't stop, right? And now we have this situation where vehicle sales have nearly stopped. The latest numbers that I'm seeing are that we're running at about 50% of normal levels in April. But vehicle production has pretty much completely stopped in North America, and so has the supply base. So the suppliers are not producing because we're largely just-in-time inventory industry. And so what is happening is this. There's a lag, call it 45, 50, 55 days from when a supplier invoices an automaker for previously supplied goods and when they receive that money. And so right now, since mid to late March, the supply base has been living on that money, those sort of backed up in the system invoices that have been paid. But we're now at the point where those are running out. And we're also now at the point where we need capital to restart production, because again, we didn't just slow it down, we stopped it. And so now you do have all kinds of additional expenses, not just the materials and the subcomponents that you need to restart production, but also the new equipment, the personal protection equipment for the employees, the retraining, and so on. And so we have much more of a liquidity trap situation in this scenario than we did back in 2009.
Interesting. Tell me about the global supply chain. I've seen, a lot of countries go to measures to bring, a lot of manufacturing back into the country. They're moving people back to they've been moving people back to the country and so on and so forth. What does this do to the global supply chain and how does that affect, North American manufacturing?
Yeah, Luke, excuse me, most immediately it is this. The average vehicle that we build here in North America has, let's say, 10 to 15,000 components, depending on who's counting. And what that means is essentially we need all of that to be in place before you can actually take that vehicle from the plant and roll it out to the dealership. As you mentioned, the supply chain is global. And you don't really have to even look across the ocean for areas of concern. One is that, for example, Mexico, outside the US, that is our #1 source of inputs into vehicle production. Mexico has been on a different trajectory when it comes to this coronavirus crisis. They're, basically a few weeks behind us. And so they have yet to see the worst of this crisis. And frankly, there are those in the industry that are concerned about the steps that are being taken there and whether they're going to be enough to have an orderly return back to production. And so, we're very much dependent on what happens there. Obviously, China is a huge source of inputs, but frankly, it's even more so than one might think because a good deal of the things that we get from, for example, Thailand or elsewhere, or even Mexico, a lot of those components start with subcomponents or materials that originated from China. And so as we come back, we need this global system to start replenishing at every level. And there's always a little bit of inventory at each one of those steps. And in many cases, that inventory has oceans to cross. So it is a critical element that has to be there to restart production. And there's a great deal of uncertainty about whether we can get there because it's dependent upon how effective the national policies of restraining this coronavirus crisis are in those individual countries.
So I'm going to jump in too. What can you tell me? How will this affect the consumer? How do you feel that this will, I will look at myself personally. I need a new car in the next 3 to 5 months. How do you think it's going to affect someone like me?
Yeah, so sure thing, Stacy. Right now the big X factor in all of this is the duration of this, because when we started initially tracking this crisis and its impacts on the industry, we've gone through a progression. Initially we were just focused on, okay, what are we getting from China directly or indirectly, and how's that going to impact production here? Then when we had our own bubbles starting to form, we looked at just the production disruption of people can't show up for work. Now we've moved on to the really mature phase of this crisis, which is what you were just talking about, which is the effect on consumers, which is to say that things have really, really slowed down in the overall economy. We have millions of people that are out of work. We have these federal programs which are described as stimulus, but really they're just a partial recouping of what we're losing out of the economy. And we just had our first quarter of negative growth, or a negative GDP growth, that is, since 2014, and the most negative quarter we've had since 2008, when the Great Recession started. So the longer this goes on, I see it as a progression, right? When this thing first hit and people couldn't go to a dealership to buy a car, there was a greater chance that, okay, that intended new car buyer will wait out a week, 2, 3, whatever the thing is, and then they'll still buy that car that they were intending to buy originally, right? And that's that pent-up demand that we're counting on. However, the longer this goes on, the more that new car intender is likely to become a used car intender. And the longer it goes on after that, that used car intender may become someone who just keeps their existing vehicle and spends a little money into maintaining it or doing any repairs that have been sort of neglected. And so that is a huge impact for the industry, because once someone moves from that new car bucket to that used car bucket, for all intents and purposes, the revenue stream for us stops, right? Apart from a few aftermarket parts. So it is completely a duration-based equation, because the longer it goes, the more you move people from one bucket to the other. Right now, CAR's own optimistic scenario is that, let's say we have a shutdown of only 6 weeks, which we are kind of in that mode right now. If that happens, we'll lose just under 1 million sales for the year. And that's the optimistic scenario. There's a pretty darn good chance it'll be more than that, depending on how long this goes on.
I have to stay in the new car bucket, so I'll be that person.
We really appreciate it. You're going to make a lot of friends in the automotive industry if you just share that information broadly. You're exactly the kind of consumer that we're hoping for.
I'm really good at being everybody's consumer, so, you know.
Bless your heart.
What was steepest decline in car sales during the Great Recession, and where's it at right now?
So during the Great Recession, Luke, we, from the prior peak to the bottom, essentially lost, call it roughly half the market. We're nowhere near that now. Right now, we believe that we're tracking at, in the month of April at about 50% of what the month would otherwise have been if not for the coronavirus crisis. I can tell you that our January forecast at CAR, because we do produce US vehicle sales forecasts of our own, and already prior to the crisis hitting, we thought 2020 would be the bottom of this current sales cycle. And just for context, in 2016, we set an all-time record with 17.5 million units sold. And every year since 2016, we've come down just a little bit, come down just a little bit. It has not by any means been a cliff of any sort, just a very gradual coming off the peak. And we really thought that 2020 would be the bottom of that cycle. And in 2021, things would start picking back up again, and we would be back into recovery mode. Obviously, this current coronavirus situation has exacerbated that whole trough scenario. And it's unfortunate because if the coronavirus crisis had to hit, it's unfortunate that it was hitting us at a point where we were already expected to bottom out, right? Because if it hit us on the way up, at least there's an element of a rising tide lifting all boats. You don't have the saturated market, where right now we have an unparalleled period of vehicle sales. So many people who are capable of buying a new vehicle already have one, right? And so because we hit that part of the cycle with the coronavirus, I think we're paying a bigger price than we otherwise would.
What's the current crisis do for new model production versus going back and pushing inventory out and finishing kind of the last round of production? What is there a stop and start? Is there a delay? How does that work?
Yeah, so look, what we're hearing is that inventory is still there. One of the things about 2020 being a slowing vehicle market is because things were slowing down, we had more inventory than we would have liked, which is turning out to be a bit of a silver lining now that we're no longer producing and it's gone on for a few weeks. So the inventory of what's available, my understanding from what I've been told by the people that are sort of monitoring this pretty closely, is that it's very much segment dependent. So far this year, the only two segments that are showing growth, everything is down except one, the broad category of electrified vehicles, which is a blend of different segments. But the only sort of pure segment is pickup trucks, and pickup sales are up, I believe, 2.3% so far this year. And so from what I've been hearing, it's pickup inventory is running low, as is inventory of certain crossover and SUV utility vehicles.
So that's an area that production could potentially have to pick up and fill a void fairly quickly. And when it comes to Sterling Heights, the Ram at Shep is something that may lead at least a local recovery much more quickly because of the product type.
Yes, absolutely. We've been trying to get our arms around which plants are more likely to open early in terms of the vehicle assembly plants that you'd want to turn on first to replenish some of that depleted inventory that I was just talking about. And so, what I would expect is a staggered approach. that prior, for example, to turning on the RAM plant, what you would need to do is maybe 2 weeks ahead of time, ramp up the engine and the transmission plants and the supply base and so on to have at the plant the inventory of inputs that is necessary to build that vehicle. And so I think what you'll see is a ramping up of all those inputs for the critical vehicles, like Rams, F-150, Silverados, and a whole selection of utility vehicles. We're going to focus on that first and add the second tier plants, the ones that are more likely to be making conventional passenger sedans at a kind of a rolling basis thereafter.
Hi there, Bernard. I'm chiming. Sorry, I'm kind of chiming in last minute here. Do you see anything going on with the supply base and with unemployment being granted and an extra $600 a week being offered to people's pockets? Is it going to be difficult to ramp up your supply base, given that it's sometimes more lucrative to stay home than it is to go to work?
No, we have been asking suppliers that question for the most part. They feel confident that they can staff adequately because, in all honesty, those initial moments of restarting production are going to be lower volume production with fewer people in the plant. And so you don't quite need as many people, because you won't be starting every supplier plant simultaneously. You'll be starting that selection that I mentioned earlier. 2 of the ones you do start, it'll be a lower volume production scenario with, all kinds of measures taken. So, what we're hearing about companies doing is things like staggering shifts so that you don't have a group of workers leaving the plant at the same time a group is entering the plant, and so you get all that commingling. We're looking at slowed down line rates to allow for maybe greater spacing of people on the line where possible, and where it isn't possible, more partitions between the employees, more frequent breaks so that the equipment can be sanitized during those breaks. A longer changeover, by the way, between shifts also allows you to sanitize the equipment more thoroughly between shifts as well. So, all those things together, I think, mean a more gradual starting up process. And so far, it appears that we will be able to have an adequate workforce.
It's been really interesting. I was talking with some friends in the industry, and even getting a building like General Motors World Headquarters up and started again with the proper distancing, the proper cleaning, and the proper sanitization is a massive undertaking. I mean, they've brought in even folks like Autodesk to use Revit to actually redesign interiors of the building to accommodate that social distancing that everybody's is going to find imperative to go back to work.
Yeah, no, we're seeing all kinds of novel approaches. We're getting very good at partitions and designing the flow of work to make some of these things possible. But it is absolutely very much a challenge. The fortunate thing is that we don't have to go back to 100% right away. And that, the hope is that as the crisis clears, as the virus over time is less and less of a risk, those times when we are coming up closer to 100% of production, we won't need as aggressive a set of measures to be taken as we will in the early stages.
So I have my cousin works for one of the logistics companies that moves vehicles from Shap and Warren Truck to their holding patterns, to their holding locations. And we were talking through yesterday some of these sanitation efforts that we'll have to go through, from taking a car off the line to its holding spot, but then for delivery wherever it goes. And I think that, like you said, the creative approaches of getting people to wrap their heads around all the steps that are going to have to do all of this, that it's not going to be, like, you're right, it's not going to be 100% automatically on day 1 through 10 or day 1 through 50 even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, in some cases, the virus has a limited shelf life just on physical spaces. And, it's a different shelf life depending on the material. So if it's on steel, stainless steel, cardboard, wood, it'll have a different lifespan. So, if that vehicle, for example, sits on a lot for a few days, odds are it's self-sanitizing because, over time without a host, that virus does die. So at least some of the duration here will be working in our favor in that regard.
Bernard, anything else kind of in closing here from a community economic development standpoint, as you guys have members across the country, what are some final thoughts that community-based economic developers should consider or should start implementing as things start to get back to work and rev back up?
Yeah, so Luke, with communities that are part of the automotive communities partnership, and by the way, we're very grateful to Sterling Heights for being a part of that. It's not financially feasible for these communities to actually prop up all of these companies, in terms of actually giving them the capital or grants or loans or something like that, in that sense of actually having the community play that role. And so what we're seeing work well is being a clearinghouse, being a source of information and an enabler for those companies to take advantage of federal programs, state programs, SBA programs, and so on. And so providing sort of a structured approach and a one-stop shopping sort of list for, hey, if you're a supplier, here are the sort of resources that are out there for you, and having the community sort of stay in touch that way is critical. There's also just the step of helping companies have access to all the personal protection equipment, the PPE. That may not be directly involved with starting production, but if you don't have it, the line can't start. So those sorts of necessary inputs that are going to be there now that weren't there before, anything the community can do to help companies just have access to that, to identify other sources if their current sources don't have it, will also be critical.
Fantastic. It's actually really good information. We're going through, I'll call it a prioritization process with the Sterling Heights Community Development Department, because they do have a new community development block grant allocation for business. And it can be used in a variety of ways. And so one of those things that we've had internal discussions on is, should we start acquiring sort of PPE packages to distribute to companies that they can use for their workforce, or maybe even additional test kits to just help prepare them. Because I'm guessing, like anybody else, people are going to try to scrounge for resources and those particular supplies to make it safe for folks to come back to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where you can have your house in order in 100 different necessary ways, but one missing element can prevent you from turning the line back on. So those things would definitely be very much favorably received.
Fantastic. Stacy or Steve, anything else?
Thank
for
you.
Bernard?
This was great.
No,
I'm good. I was actually, I had to take a phone call, unfortunately, during the same time period, but thank you for your time. I'm always interested in the auto industry and how it impacts Sterling Heights, especially, as well as Macomb County. So thanks for your insights. I'd love to talk more in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the invitation to join you. Thank you very much for being part of the Automotive Communities Partnership. We're at your service for whatever we can do. And obviously we'd be more than happy to have me join a future call, or depending on what information could be helpful, other car colleagues. So again, very much appreciate the invitation to be here today. And I'm looking forward to the next step with you guys.
Thanks, Bernard. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.